video. I saw some familiar faces in those in that footage, and it tells you a lot about what's going on with their company and rail in Texas. I have an opportunity to introduce our panelists and our moderator for our next panel. Is rail the Rodney Dangerfield of state transportation planning? And I think that's probably not a question that is exclusively asked in Texas. It's certainly one that we ask ourselves and we ask leadership. It can change from time to time depending upon who is in a leadership in a leadership position. I spent 5 years at the Department of Transportation here in Texas, and most of that time under the leadership of the Texas Transportation Commission. The chair was Deirdre DeLisi, who's with us here today. Deirdre served as Texas Governor Rick Perry's chief of staff, served as Transportation Commission chair which oversees TxDOT. It's a gubernatorially appointed position, and her leadership in transportation issues has continued even as she wisely re-entered the private sector with a lot of us and continues to track those issues. She understands these issues, cares deeply about them, and understands the role I think that we would like to see rail play in the future. And she'll moderate our discussion and host a discussion with two terrific speakers who've joined us today. John Hefner, who is an attorney with Strasburger and Price in their Washington, D.C. Office. He has a long resume of experience in private and public interests related to transportation law. He is somebody who's got familiarity with the formation of the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, also known as Amtrak, the Consolidated Rail Corporation, Conrail, and advocates on behalf of his clients, including short lines and a number of other participants in the rail industry in front of the Surface Transportation Board, the FRA, the Rail Retirement Board, and other venues. He's somebody who is known and respected across the industry, from the Class 1s to state DOTs and consultants and folks like us who are running around and trying to do what we can to improve rail in our country. So very lucky to have him. We're also joined by Chris Taylor from Arup, who's the manager of rail projects. He's a principal and serves as the project manager and lead engineer for railroad right-of-way and station projects, including some here in Texas, I believe. He has worked on many rail infrastructure planning and environmental issues as the lead engineer. He served the MTA in New York as they developed a series of projects, including the 2nd Avenue subway and the Fulton Street Transit projects, as well as other projects in the New York, New Jersey corridor, working with Amtrak and others. We're extraordinarily lucky to have him at our conference. We're also very lucky to have him working with us here in Texas. So this should be a great discussion. We do hope to save some time at the end for questions from you all. So I'll hand it over to Deirdre. Thanks so much to all of you. Welcome.
Well, I thought we'd get right to it this morning and start with the central question of the panel, which is, let's get right to it. Is rail the Rodney Dangerfield in state transportation plans? And I'd like to focus, because we're all here in Texas, and I served at the Texas Transportation Commission for 3.5 years. So let's focus this discussion initially on Texas. Is rail, in fact, the Rodney Dangerfield of transportation policy?
Gets no respect? I don't know. You folks should know better than I. Actually, I think what I'm going to do, if it's okay, is go up to the podium.
Sure.
And I need the clicker. Deirdre? Oh, I see. Sure. Let's see if it's try. It's maybe like my Apple TV device doesn't always respond. In fact, there we go. Okay, I think you've probably all heard that one before. Yeah, I do try to help you. And I am theoretically from Washington. I actually live in Alexandria, Virginia. So let's start with a few questions. In fact, first question I have is, why isn't this thing working? I'm not even sure what that is. Neither am I. Okay. Yeah, push the big button to advance it. Try again. Okay, a few questions. So let's start with a few questions, including one that I don't know the answer to. First of all, how much did China spend on railroads in 2017? $115 billion. How about Germany? How much is Japan lending India to build high-speed rail there over the next few years? How much do U.S. transit agencies spend on what is called a fixed guideway? In other words, some sort of rail-type facility as opposed to bus. What's the U.S. DOT budget for 2017? $76 billion, of which 60 is just for salaries. How much does the Federal Highway Administration spend, or did it spend, in 2017? $43 billion. How about the FAA? That's 14.7, of which 80%, of which only 80% came from your ticket taxes. The other 20% comes from your federal income taxes, or money collected from taxes. Class 1 spent roughly 14 billion. Now Amtrak, by comparison, their capital budget is about 900 million, 920. And here's the question that I don't know the answer to. How much does Texas spend annually? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to focus really on the first two. And I have a little bit of an apology. I started to prepare an Excel spreadsheet on the various programs for the 48 states that either have rail or have, basically the 48 continental states. I didn't include Hawaii because it only has an excursion railroad, a tourist railroad, and I didn't include Alaska because that's state-owned. But I found that working, I'm a lawyer, I'm not some sort of a consultant. I'm working with a very sensitive, pretty new computer, trying to move things around on a spreadsheet. Turned out to be a disaster. So that's kind of a work in progress. But we'll come back to that at the very end. So we're going to focus first on various federal programs, and then we're going to do kind of what I'll loosely call a best practices of state programs. Now let's begin with a little history. And I always love this sort of antique type font. So back in olden times, I love that term. My kids used to say to me, Dad, back in olden times, like 1400, back during the Renaissance, how much was spent on transportation? Well, it was primarily for either highways, airport development, or inland waterways, but it wasn't for rail. Now, going back to the 1970s, when I first started doing this type of thing, there were really 4 types of federal programs that involved some sort of fixed guideway. There were the, what was then called UMTA, now Federal Transit Authority, grants for public, for mass transit, like New York's MTA, Boston's MBTA. I mean, Dallas wasn't doing, maybe they were beginning to plan the light rail system. Then there was a unique program called the Local Rail Service Assistance Program, essentially a program of support to states for branch lines, branch line preservation, branch line rehabilitation. I think that program ended sometime in the 1980s. Then there were FRA loans and grants, including some that went to the bankrupt railroads, pre-Conrail, and to Conrail itself. And finally, there was the Amtrak state-supported program, commonly known as Section 403B. Now, I tried to find a good graphic, shall we say, a good image for the 1990s, and that's the best I could come up with. But in the 1990s, starting in the 1990s, we had a series of acronym-type programs focusing mostly on coffee alternatives. We had iced tea, which is the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act. Only Congress could come up with names like these. Then there was T21, Transportation Equity Act. Then there was Safety Lou. And these programs, at least as far as rail were concerned, were really heavy on policy, but close to non-existent on money. Now we have 4 smaller programs that we'll come back to. There was the Section 130 Grade Crossing Improvement or Elimination Program. There was CMAQ, congestion grants, which benefited basically commuter rail or perhaps intercity rail masquerading as commuter rail. There were Small Business Administration loans, and for short lines, yes, theoretically, you can get SBA funding. Same thing under the Rural Electrification Program. There's money there. Now, starting in the year 2008, that's when we began to have some real policy changes, and maybe not a huge amount of money, but there started to be a trickle. First of all, we have what I call PRIA 1, which is the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act. And then under President Obama, his first year, we had the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And that program, the second one, the ARRA, or ARRA, that gave us $8 billion of high-speed seed money. And it got programs like what Michigan and Illinois are doing off the ground. Now, then we began to have a series of acronym programs, acronym names. We had TIFIA, which sounds like a bone. We had Tiger Grants. We had RIF, the Railroad Rehabilitation Improvement Fund, which actually goes back to 1998. And finally, excuse me, I can just get the page. We had, and it's not really a program as it is a tax benefit, we had the 45G tax credit. And I'm not sure exactly when that started, but I'll take a guess and say that's about 15 years old. Now, just to focus for a couple of minutes on each of these, going back, starting with TIFIA, that basically is a major infrastructure program. It's primarily for public agencies. It's primarily for projects of over $50 million. And while it can benefit a private entity, essentially the applicant has to be a public agency, and it has benefited things like intermodal facilities, ports, highways. I love this one. Intelligent transportation systems. That certainly is not something that any sort of person is involved with. Must be like driverless trucks. And mass transit. Mass transit has benefited greatly. While some TIFIA money has been used for passenger rail, for the most part it's pretty limited. It's not for your typical short line project because we're talking big bucks. Then we have Tiger Grants. Now, the leading thing in terms of short lines when I think of Tiger Grants is the roughly, I want to say it's something around $40 to $50 million that the New England Central Railroad got to upgrade the line that Amtrak's Vermonter uses. So under this program, $500 million has been appropriated for projects through 2020. Generally, these projects are fairly small, 15, 20, 25 million. It must have a significant regional or national impact, and to date, about $5 billion has been awarded, and of which about $250 million have been for short lines. Now, RIF, that is a program that's got a special place in my heart because it's intended for short line projects or for well, it's really for rail generally, and a lot of short lines have attempted to use it. Some passenger rail projects have used it. The theory behind RIF is a loan guarantee program through the FRA, Federal Railroad Administration, for railroad applicants that are, and I love this, they are too poor to get a loan from a commercial source, but they're too well off. It's kind of that sweet spot. They can't get a loan from like a bank, but they're sufficiently well off that they can afford to pay it back. What that really means is these loans are for a longer term of time than you could usually get through a bank, and supposedly at a lower interest rate. And apparently, and it's a revolving loan program, what it sounds like is a perpetual motion machine because there's no appropriation. The idea is you borrow the money, you pay it back, and that gives seed money for the next applicant that wants to borrow money. The program has been very unwieldy. It's not customer friendly, and a lot of applicants that were well qualified have been turned down. The 45G tax credit, very simply, I'll just advance that. That is a provision in the tax code that gets renewed every year, but it's always a cliffhanger because you want to go and spend, if you're a short line, you want to go and fix the engine house or rehabilitate 10 miles of really sad track, and you never know until roughly Christmas Day whether or not you're going to get the tax credit, and then everybody's scrambling. That's not a way to do business. But essentially it allows a regional railroad, a Class 2, or a short line, a Class 3, to reduce their taxes by 50% of the cost of the track maintenance expense, limited to a certain ceiling. And if your short line is not making a sufficient profit to enable you to use the tax credit, you can sell it to a third party like a customer or even the short line's owner who might be able to. It has been used for all kinds of improvements, engine houses, buying equipment, fixing track, and so on and so forth. Now, in this particular slide, I titled it Out of the Box Thinking, but really what I should have called it is Overlooked Programs. And you see a guy going like this, Jesus, I forgot about this, or I forgot about that. And once again, we come back to the Section 130 grade crossing program. That is through the Federal Highway Administration, and it allows a railroad that wants to fix, upgrade, eliminate a grade crossing to get 90 cents on the dollar. The local entity, whether it be a private source or public source, has to come up with the rest. And it provides $235 million in grant money for grade crossing improvements. The rural electrification loans. Now that's one that a one-time client of mine used to buy the railroad that he bought from his former employer. The guy, in other words, got $3 million loan. Yes, the railroad had to be in an agricultural rural area. It was in Arkansas and Louisiana. The Federal Transit Administration has a series of different funding programs, roughly $2.5 billion a year through 2020, and again, the Cascade Service and the Downeaster and numerous commuter rail projects have been able to use federal transit money. Private activity bonds. This is not something normally associated with railroads. It's a private activity bond goes back to Safety Lou. Remember Safety Lou a few minutes ago? That program authorizes the Secretary of Transportation to issue $15 billion in bonds. To date, about 2/3 have been issued. Essentially, it's kind of a municipal type bond where the interest would not be taxable to the holder of the bond or the person who buys the bond, and therefore it's a lower cost type financing, and it has been used by Denver for its RTD transit service. I'll be riding on the RTD later today because I'm flying to Denver at the end, and I'll be taking the commuter rail from the airport and then transferring to the light rail where my daughter will pick me up. It's been used by Maryland MTA for building the Purple Line, which is essentially a light rail line. It's being used on the Moynihan Penn Station project in New York. Now, moving along, we have the FAST Act. And don't you love what happened there? Huh. Well. What's that? Yeah, that was really fast. The FAST Act is the first federal law in over a decade. See what happens if I press another button. Oh well. I can make this available. The FAST Act resulted in what I call PREA 2. The FAST Act overall is a whole series of federal programs of which a small part involves railroads. And it spawned the Passenger Rail Reform and Investment Act, which again is high on policy and modest on money. It authorizes about about $300 million, billion dollars over about a 5-year period for various types of transportation programs, including rail. It authorizes 3 separate railroad programs that I'm going to mention right now. I'll give you an overview. The first one is called Christie, or Chrissy, I mean. The second one is called the Federal State Partnership for Good Repair, and the third one are the Restoration and Enhancement Grants. Essentially, Chrissy grants is a series of grants to finance passenger and freight rail improvements. And you can have a private applicant, in other words, a short line or a Class 2 railroad can apply. A public agency can apply. Even a railroad vendor can apply. And it's designed to benefit a whole series of capital projects. Despite this great concept and great name, $68 million was appropriated. I mean, that's barely enough to take care of the consultants, right? Now, in addition, and in fact, I even want to say it wasn't appropriated, it was authorized. I say here in the text, but it was appropriated. But the appropriation is not final because the House and Senate versions have different amounts and they haven't been reconciled. And again, it's a federal, non-federal matching program. And of course, a certain amount, 25%, has to be for rural projects. Now, the Federal State Partnership for State of Good Repair, essentially that's to bring Amtrak facilities that are under-maintained up to snuff. Again, the House and the Senate haven't agreed, so what we're looking at is probably something in the $25 million range, not a hell of a lot of money. Again, barely enough to pay for the consultants. Now, here's one that really fascinates me, the Restoration and Enhancement Grants. And I really have a lot of praise for those 3 senators. I'm not sure why Thune signed on, considering that South Dakota has no passenger rail, but, you know, that's one of those questions. Maybe someday, if I meet him, I'll ask him. I have met Senator Wicker. I think this is really the Gulf Coast Sunset Limited Restoration Act. Essentially, it's to restore passenger rail that was either eliminated or for communities like maybe Houston that are underserved by passenger rail, 3 times a week. So essentially, it's a program to restore discontinued passenger service. And theoretically, and I see no reason why not, the route of the Lone Star, the Texas Chief between, say, Dallas and Kansas City couldn't benefit from this. Now, obviously that's a picture of a high-speed passenger train, not in the United States. A little wishful thinking. So I want to talk for a couple of minutes about the FRA long-distance pilot program and then about the state-subsidized non-Amtrak service. You may not have noticed, or maybe you noticed, that there haven't, with one exception, been any short-haul intercity trains run by private operators. The Congress, going back to PREA 1 and then re-amplified in PREA 2, decided that FRA should hold kind of a beauty contest to see if private entrepreneurs or private entities, or maybe even what we call the host railroads like Union Pacific or BNSF, would be interested in taking over the operation of up to 3 Amtrak long-distance trains and receiving an operating grant of 90% of the amount that Amtrak would have gotten. And presumably that would be for some unending amount of time, in other words, permanently. So the FRA went through a rulemaking process. They finally promulgated a regulation. The applications are due March 7th. I don't know if anybody applied yet. I'm not aware of anybody applying as yet, but you still have, I guess, about 6-7 weeks to get in your application. The major stumbling block on both this and the short distance program is you have to reach a deal with your host railroad. Now, of course, if you are the host railroad, that's not a problem. But say you're an outfit like Keolis or Bombardier, Veolia, or whatever its new name is, Herzog, and you want to take over the operation of the Empire Builder, you have to reach a deal with BNSF. And while Amtrak, if Amtrak wanted to run, say, on the Kansas City Southern, they could mandate that. They could, if they and the Kansas City Southern didn't reach a deal, Amtrak can go to the Surface Transportation Board and can compel access, but Herzog can't. This brings us to the short haul passenger trains. The short haul in PREA 1 and PREA 2 is defined as a train under 750 miles. Now, if I said to any of my friends, and a lot of my friends are not, unlike me, shall we say, a rail activist, I'm going to take a 600-mile train, 600-mile long train, they wouldn't consider that short distance at all. But again, it allows a state like Texas to contract with a private entity like Herzog. Again, with one exception, there have been no takers, and unfortunately that one failed. Now, let's think outside the box, and this is the correct slide. Suppose that you wanted to add a train between, let's say, here and Kansas City on BNSF, and suppose that you were able to qualify for one of these grants and you submitted your application to USDOT or FRA, but it didn't quite fit the criteria. What would happen? I don't know, but nobody's tried. Now let's talk for a couple of minutes about freight railroading. Suppose that you own a freight line that is in substantial need of work. You could enhance your chances of getting some federal funding if you either put passenger on it or you invite Amtrak or some other passenger entity to provide service over it. As you can see, that's the United States. There are no red states or blue states, you will note. But just to take a couple of minutes, should I ever complete this Excel spreadsheet, what you would find is that there are 19 states that currently fund some sort of Amtrak service. They range at the high point from California, which has an immensely complex, well-funded program with lots of infrastructure improvements, down to Vermont, where the state, a comparatively small and poor state, is spending several $1 million a year on its Amtrak trains. Now, in terms of freight, there are about 35 states that have some sort of freight rail programs. Texas, believe it or not, does. There are about 15 that don't. And again, we have a a significant range in terms of what various states are doing. Surprisingly, California does not have a robust program. Some states do it through an industrial access program. Some states, like Pennsylvania and Vermont, do it directly. Wisconsin, which has a very healthy program, has to do it through kind of an intermediary. Now show me the money. And so where do we find the money? Again, CMAQ, Tiger, FTA. All these programs require a local or state match. So there's no such thing as 100% free money, with a handful of exceptions. Now, states have frequently done it through bond measures. They've done it through highway taxes, taxes on motor vehicle registration, rental cars, all kinds of things like that. And how can if you're issuing a bond, how can it be amortized? Now, it's been done outside the United States, and it looks like Brightline may be doing it, Amtrak might be doing it. So it's a question of essentially creativity. I'll leave you with this final thing, this final thought. You start with your Department of Transportation. You then go to your Metropolitan Planning Officer. If you're in a city, you obtain support from business leaders. And if you remember the movie The Godfather, don't wait to meet the politicians when you're ready to ask for money. Build a relationship first. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. I was a little stressed out when Peter asked me to do this presentation on Rodney Dangerfield. I usually present on more detailed project design issues, and this is kind of big picture thinking. I'm going to get my presentation up here. But I was lucky to be on a cruise last week in the Caribbean, and I had a lot of those drinks with the little umbrellas in it, so freed up my mind to think a little bit bigger. And so are we the Rodney Dangerfield and the state transportation plans? Why is it so hard to move those projects forward, and how can our projects get the respect they deserve? The first part of the question is easy. Are we Rodney Dangerfield? Yes, we are. If you look at funding, rail is not a priority. This is just two states, the distribution of funding, Oklahoma and Texas. And except for the anomaly of the Tex Rail project and the red and blue line platform extensions, the rail element doesn't even show up. It's down there at the bottom, right about zero. So the question is, why don't Southwest projects move forward? And I think it's because the Southwest region is not really well defined or organized. I think we have a lack of public support for rail projects. And that's because our existing rail systems are limited. There's a car mentality. And we have very poor connectivity at the destination, so people will not use those systems. And of course, lastly, there's always competition for limited resources. So if you look at the Southwest region, New Mexico and Arizona are always considered part of the Southwest. Texas and Oklahoma sometimes aren't. And then California, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado can be either called the Southwest or the West. And if you look at how it's been broken up by a lot of the major players, you have Amtrak on the left there. There's really a California, then there's a Northwest, and there's a Western division. If you look at the FTA, it breaks it up a little bit differently. And then if you look at the FRA, they have a South Central and a Southwest, and Texas is not in the Southwest. So I think we must determine where our home is and how we want to organize. And I will move forward with the rest of the presentation that it's New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and Oklahoma. And I don't think we want to be lumped in with California. So do we deserve respect? Absolutely. 5 of the 10 fastest growing large cities are in these 4 states. And there's been steady population growth since the 1950s. If you look at the chart on the lower right, the Northeast has been going down in representing the percentage of the U.S. population, and the South and the West has been going up. Our rail systems have a very long way to go to attract the attention and the demand for further investment in resources. We have limited existing services. We have the daily Heartland service between Oklahoma City and Fort Worth. We have the Sunset Limited, which runs a wonderful tri-weekly service between Los Angeles and New Orleans. And we have the daily Texas Eagle service between Chicago and San Antonio. And those systems all have poor on-time performance, and most of the key connections require bus transfers. So if you look at your options, the distances are very large, and the travel times and services are not competitive. So a lot of the corridors are shared, which presents challenges. So if you were going to make a travel decision, say you wanted to go from Dallas to Houston, you could drive it in 3.5 hours, or you could take the train in about 15 hours. Or you could take one of 19 different planes. And even when there are good rail times, if you look at, say, Albuquerque to Flagstaff, where it's about 5 hours either by driving or by rail, there's only one service a day. And then there's the crazy situations where if you really wanted to take the train from El Paso to Albuquerque, it takes 63 hours. So city planning, I think, is a problem. Urban centers in the Southwest have limited rail transit systems, and all of our systems are shown as either emerging or evolving. As of 2007, Oklahoma had no commuter rail. We have poor connectivity at the destination. Transit service in almost every major city in the Southwest region is largely limited to bus. In 2013, looking at the National Transit Database, almost all of the use of public transportation was by bus. And ridership is low. This is from the transit database as well. The transit usage is well below where it should be in the Southwest. If you look at the ranking of major cities in the United States, Dallas is number 6 in terms of population, but it's number 18 in terms of transit usage. And Houston is number 7, and it's number 17 in terms of transit usage. And the other cities really just don't even show up. They're down in the 20s and 50s ranking. The Southwest has a car mentality. The major Southwest cities have an average of greater than 2 vehicles per household, where the Northeast cities average less than 1 vehicle per household. And the top 10 cities for public transportation, none of them are in the Southwest. If you look at the figure on the right, the light-colored dots are where the car usage is low, the car ownership is low, and the dark dots are where it's very high. And you can see that Southwest is primarily a car mentality. At one time, Texas did have an extensive rail network of passenger services that linked all of the communities in Texas and linked it to the rest of the country. But that has fallen off, and that can be directly linked to the growth in automobile usage. The lower left shows starting in 1950 the growth in auto manufacturing worldwide. And you can see that the growth in auto manufacturing exactly runs parallel with the elimination of rail options within Texas and the growth of the population in Texas. Of course, there's competition with the highway for limited resources. Southwest states, very large, they have a low population to lane mile ratio. If you look at New York, for example, it has 500% of the population of Oklahoma, but it only has 3% more lane miles. And it's entirely reasonable to expect that the population will want their roads fixed. Everyone uses roads, not everyone uses transit. So this creates a great demand for investment in highway service, which is rational. There's also a lot of competition for resources, say, from the FRA for funding. If you look at FRA regional rail funding, $7.9 billion went to rail funding over 2009 to 2015, and only $207 million went to the Southwest. That's a disgrace, and we need to do better. Every other project is in California, as shown on this plan. The FRA graph shows projects in the high-speed rail area in California, And in the Southwest, it's largely planning projects in NEPA for below 90 miles an hour, except for Texas Central High-Speed Rail. If you look at the FRA's projects that are under environmental review in the Southwest, there's only two: Texas Central High-Speed Rail and the Dallas-Fort Worth Core Express. So we're not getting the attention that we deserve. Now, the public is beginning to realize that regional planning is required and the population of the United States is moving towards urban centers, and that we need to organize around those major urban centers. States will become less important as these large economic engines span across state borders. If you look at America 2050, they've certainly designed their plan around 10 mega regions in the United States, 3 of which lie within the Southwest as I have defined it. And we need to link those up to limit a demand on natural resources and to provide for that growth and connect them in with the other smaller cities. If you look at the Arizona Sun Corridor, the Front Range, and the Texas Triangle, by 2050, that'll be about 65 million people, or roughly somewhere around 15 to 20% of the entire U.S. population. So we should get the respect we deserve. So how do we get that? We need to better define and organize the Southwest and leverage the strength within our mega regions and link them together. We need to work together as a region to support significant improvements in the intercity rail. And that will include trip time and frequency improvements through upgrades and new operational strategies. We need to collaborate on capital investment planning and funding strategies that will yield benefits for both passenger and freight. Everyone must win. We need to support development in the metropolitan areas of transit so that we solve that last mile problem and make intercity transportation by rail actually more feasible for the riders. And of course, we need to get our fair share of limited resources. How do we get the funding? Link planning of intercity and intercity rail projects to make projects more viable and more attractive to multiple funding sources through joint benefits. We also need to link projects between multiple cities and mega regions to have broad benefits that make those projects attractive to regional and federal funding. We need to identify and engage other entities in planning efforts. Broad stakeholder involvement is required to ensure support and success. And we must partner with non-transportation interest groups such as economic development and business improvement districts with similar goals and objectives. As Rodney Dangerfield said, when his parents got divorced, it was a custody battle and nobody showed up for the fight. Well, our projects need parents and we need support, and we want people to show up to the fight to support the projects. And one thing that I think is very important is we must spread the word. We must sell the benefits of passenger rail to the general public, and most importantly to the non-users. The benefits to the young, elderly, and disabled. Less congestion on highways, less fuel consumption, less greenhouse gas emissions, excellent safety records. The freight railroad has done a great job at doing this. You'll see freight advertisement on primetime TV. There's very few people sitting on the couch that are going to go out and buy freight rail service. But they've sold the success of freight rail to the public. I'm originally from New Jersey, and a lot of people travel on the Northeast Corridor to New York. But it's really only about 350,000 people, and there's 9 million people in New Jersey. So how do you get those other 8.5 million people to support further investment in rail? You have to communicate to them that economic activity is generated by those people going into the city, and it would take another 10 lanes of rush hour congested highways to move the same 25,000 people an hour into Manhattan. That's how you sell it to the non-users. So what do we need the public to do? We need them to recognize that an overdependence on driving does not address the needs of everyone, especially the young, the disabled, and the elderly. And what do we need to do? Well, success will need hard work. We need to do absolutely all that is needed to support growth of transit systems in our cities and environmentally friendly, safe, and efficient rail technologies for new and enhanced intercity services that are supported by emerging technologies to address the last mile problem of accessibility in our destinations and origin cities. Thank you.
We only have a couple minutes left, so I thought I would actually open it up to the floor. Does anybody in the audience have any questions for the panelists? Yes, sir, go.
My question is for John. First, I have a comment. When Johnny Carson died, his publicist called the publicist of Rodney Dangerfield and asked if Rodney had a comment on Johnny's death. And the publicist said, well, Rodney's been dead for years, but I have a comment. Even in death, Rodney gets no respect. John, those programs, those federal programs you talked about, are any of those available to replace the twin tunnels under the Hudson River? And what happens to the American economy if those tunnels go away? Thank you.
Well, I could probably answer the second one first. It would be an absolute disaster if those tunnels went away. I don't have any statistics, but a significant number of commuters who work in New York come from New Jersey. I guess maybe ferries will come back, but it would be an economic disaster that would reach far beyond the Northeast corridor. It would be a national crisis. So that's probably how I would answer that. I'm trying to remember actually what your first question was by now. Yes, I think
Available to replace those tunnels.
the answer is maybe. The problem is that there's theoretically some of those programs could work. There's not enough money appropriated. An authorization is like a dream. An appropriation is like a reality.
I saw one more hand up over here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this question is more directed toward high-speed rail, which requires specific type of right-of-way acquisition, which seems to be the biggest impediment for building anything new in this country with all the bananas that we have around the country. That's build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. Anyway, how do you think we can solve that issue of right-of-way?
Well, some particularly outside, say, the Northeast, on many railroad rights-of-way, there's more than enough width to accommodate high-speed rail. And that's what's being done in California. I think that's the reason why the California High-Speed Rail Authority is building its line through the San Joaquin Valley rather than closer to the coast. So I know of many places, and I've traveled very extensively on Amtrak. I can tell you that in Illinois, for example, on the old Alton or GM&O line, there's plenty of space to add multiple tracks, so you could have dedicated freight and dedicated passenger. It's in the Northeast where things are so dense population-wise that there's really not a lot of room to add new capacity. So, and also there are various gradations of high speed and higher speed, some of which actually can share the same track. And as you may know, if you've taken the TGV in France, for the first, 30 or so miles, the TGV and other types of trains share the same right-of-way, and it's my understanding they will from San Francisco to San Jose.
Yes, right-of-way is certainly a significant problem. I've been leading the conceptual engineering for the Texas Central project for the last few years, and right-of-way is, of course, one of the major concerns that's raised at all of the public open house meetings. And it's understandable. With any major project of that scale, there are going to be people who are going to have to give up some type of land. And the key to success is to have regular engagement of the stakeholders, to reach out to them, to explain the benefits of the project to the general public, and of course to treat the landowners fairly. And I think that Texas Central has done a great job over the last few years of going out and sending crews of people to speak to all the landowners and to find ways to develop a design which best mitigates the impacts that they will face, and to ensure that any land that is needed for the project, that they are compensated more than fairly, and to the extent practical, that the design addresses their concerns for access and other issues.
All right, we have time for one more quick question. Right back here? Oh, no, I'm sorry. Right here. Go ahead.
I have a question for Mr. Taylor. In regards to automated vehicles and passenger rail, I could see some ways that they could be competitors, but other ways that they could be collaboratively used, especially for the first mile, last mile. Can you talk about more of the relationship between those two?
Yeah, I think it's a very exciting technology, the connected and autonomous vehicles. And I have to admit, I wasn't originally convinced. I'm one of these guys that, likes to be in my car and I have a bunch of stuff on the seat. And, when I get in my car and turn on my radio, I'm in my own zone. But I have seen the benefits of it recently, and even Uber is amazing. The flexibility. I was in Sydney, Australia with my wife walking around, and anytime we got tired of hiking, you just hit your phone and somebody shows up. There's been a lot of movement in that technology recently of linking up transit systems with that type of service, with Lyft and with Uber. I think a lot of transit agencies are now allowing some seamless ticketing between those types of services and the transit that allows them to reduce their services on less used bus routes. For people that are elderly or disabled or vision impaired, I think that the Lyft and Uber technology is a godsend that will allow them to readily be able to get a connection to that next link to solve that last mile problem. And I think that the safety issue of cars being able to talk to each other on the road will help reduce the difficulties with the dangers of driving on that last mile link. So I am very encouraged by the technology, and I think that connected and autonomous vehicles and those types of services will be a godsend to the transit market, because it'll make that last mile feasible, which is the solution.
Thank you. I think that's our time. Thanks, gentlemen, for your interesting conversation and discussion, and look forward to the rest of the presentations.
Deirdre, before we let you go, if you could just spend a minute or two and tell us what your thoughts are on the future and where do we need to be in Texas. You served as Transportation Commission Chair, and just kind of interested to get kind of a quick overview from you.
Well, the panelists touched on this. In Texas, we have a very strong car mentality, and actually it wasn't until it happened to be when I was on the commission and chair of the commission, we changed our mission statement to reflect all modes of transportation, because up till about 2011 or 12, whenever we did that, we were a road-focused agency, and that was even though we had lip service to other modes of transportation, everything was like 99% road. So we started with some baby steps, right? We changed the mission statement. We created the rail division. We hired Bill to kick that off and to try and bring a focus to rail. But we're still not doing enough. I mean, this was alluded to in the last presentation. There has to be a coordination between not only the rail advocates, but the economic development agencies, the chambers, the mayors, the local electeds who see the value of rail. And that value in other modes of transportation has to be, in my opinion, better articulated to the policy leaders, because right now, when elected officials go home, and to the extent that they have a scorecard on transportation, it's all about how many lane miles you build. It's not about rail. It's not about a more efficient transportation system overall. So I think overall what needs to be done is building a better grassroots effort, bringing in a lot of different folks to the table to see the benefits of both passenger and freight rail. And that's got to work its way up to the policymakers, so that there is that rail and transit and other modes of transportation aren't an afterthought, that they're part of a global transportation solution in Texas.